Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Combs-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Director of Education. Thank you to our community partners on today's program, Seattle University History Department, University of Washington History Department, and the Evergreen College Alumni Association. This program is being recorded and will be available on our website starting tomorrow. The views, information, or opinions expressed in these programs are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the Holocaust Center for Humanity. The Holocaust Center for Humanity in downtown Seattle sits on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish people, the first people of Seattle. Today's Lunch and Learn program is our last of 2020, as we will be taking the next 2 weeks off. But we have some great programming lined up for you in 2021. I know that some of you attending today tune into this program every Tuesday. Some of you come for particular topics of interest, and for others, this might be your first time joining us. With the onslaught of COVID-19 and the abrupt closures in March of public spaces, we looked for ways that we could fill a community need and continue offering inspiring, informative programs that would challenge us to understand the Holocaust from different perspectives. Not knowing how long the shutdown would last, we decided to offer a program every Tuesday. We started with members of our Speakers Bureau and experimented with the technology. And with the killing of George Floyd, rising COVID-19 deaths, and a contentious political cycle, it seemed all the more imperative that we provide programming content that was relevant and timely, using the Holocaust as a lens to help us better understand our world today and to inspire us to action. Here we are today, offering our 37th virtual Lunch and Learn program, 37 weeks of continuous programming since our first one on Tuesday, March 31st. Thank you to all of you who have hung in there with us. We will continue to bring these programs to you every Tuesday after our 2-week break, starting again on January 5th. It's my great pleasure to have with us today Knute Berger, one of my favorite local journalists, for his in-depth reporting, curiosity, and ability to highlight aspects of our local history. Knute is the editor-at-large for Crosscut and has previously served as editor for Seattle Weekly and Seattle Magazine. He is the host of Mossbach's Northwest on KCTS and PBS. In June, Knute spoke about real Nazis of the Northwest at our Lunch and Learn program. If you missed it, I would highly recommend going back and watching the recording, which you can find on our website, along with recordings of all of our previous programs. Knute emailed me a couple months ago about a new book, The SS Officer's Armchair, and recommended the author for our Lunch and Learn programming. Today's program is an interview, a conversation really, between journalist Knute Berger and historian and author Daniel Lee. Knute and Daniel Lee will take questions at the end of the program. Please put your questions in the chat to the panelists. You can write in questions at any time, and you will notice the Q&A feature isn't enabled today, so please just use the chat. We will still get your questions. If you are watching on Facebook Live, you can enter the questions in the comments. Knute, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Lana. It's really great to be back as part of this program. And I'm especially excited because of the gentleman that we're going to be talking with today. And hopefully with your questions, all of us will be part of the conversation. Daniel Lee is author, professor, historian based in London, and he has written about the Holocaust. His new book, The SS Officer's Armchair, Uncovering the Hidden Life of a Nazi. We're going to be talking about that book today. Welcome, Daniel.
Hi, Knute. I'm going to figure out how to unmute and put on my video. I think I've been successful, so it's lovely to see you and lovely to see so many friends in Seattle. I should say, I don't think I ever told you this, Knute, but I was sitting in Seattle the day that I received the front cover to my book. And I remember getting the email and just seeing this beautiful front cover and just not knowing what to do. And I just turned to the woman next to me. I was sitting in Elm Coffee Roasters and just saying, what do you think of this front cover? Do you think I should tell my publisher that this is a good idea, da, da, da. And obviously I didn't continue the conversation very long with her, but if she is out there today, thank you very much for your advice.
Well, yeah, it's a great cover. And one of the things about the book that's so intriguing is it's a bit of a detective story. And it begins with a woman approaching you, I believe at a conference in Italy, and telling you something. And I wonder if you could pick up a bit of the story there. What did she tell you and why was it interesting?
Absolutely, thank you. I would like to say it did happen in an academic setting, but like so many events, fortuitous events, it actually happened in much more of a social setting. So you're absolutely right. I was living in Florence. I just moved there from England to begin new research, and I was in the European University, and there were people there from all over the world. And not knowing anybody in the city, I organized a small gathering at my new place for some new sort of researchers who were also in town. And a woman came up to me who had also just started at the university. She was a lawyer from Amsterdam. And she just said to me, "Oh, you're that new historian of the Second World War. The most remarkable thing has just happened to my mother, and I wanted to tell you about it." And immediately I was gripped by this because, you know, when you are a historian of the Second World War, people do like to share their stories with you. It's very normal. They tell you about aunts who are in the resistance, or uncles or grandfathers who might have been deported. But these things happened many, many years ago, 70, 80 years ago. Things don't just happen to people's mothers. Anyway, so she proceeded to tell me at this moment in Florence how her mum had, the week before, taken this old armchair to be reupholstered.
I think we have a picture of it.
Yes, we do. So this was the armchair that she took to be reupholstered, and she went to collect it a couple of days later. And when she did, the guy who was doing the work on the chair, the upholsterer in Amsterdam, was very cross with her. He sort of looked at her and he said, "What is this? I don't do work for Nazis or their families." And he presented her with a bundle of documents that he had discovered sewn into the cushion of the armchair. And all the documents had Nazi-era stamps on them, and they all belonged to one man called Robert Griesinger. Oh, here we are. So here's a picture of one of the passports that was discovered inside the armchair. And so this woman sort of is standing there in the middle of this shop in Amsterdam with, people doing all the work around repair work, what have you. And, she's totally flabbergasted because this man had thought that she was Robert Griezinger's daughter or niece or something like that, that she was a relative. Whereas this woman had absolutely no idea who this man was. She did not inherit the armchair. She was a student and she was living in Prague. She was not Dutch, she was Czech. And in the late 1960s, she just, like so many of us, Knute, she just needed some cheap furniture in order to furnish her student digs. So one day she went around Prague and just bought a whole load of goods, tables, chairs, wardrobes, etc. And she had this chair for many, many, many years. And then in the 1980s, when some families were allowed to leave communist Czechoslovakia, they were able to take certain objects with them on the train to the Netherlands. And so having had this object, having fallen in love with it, it was one of the objects that she brought with. And so it's been in the family for 50 years. It's in the background of scores of family photos. And this woman at this party in Florence just said to me, I've used to sit in this armchair to do my homework. I had no idea I was sitting on this guy's papers. Who was Robert Griesinger? And how on earth did his documents end up in a chair in my bedroom?
That's just incredible. What a find. And so when you were told the story about these documents being recovered, I'm sure you have lots of projects and research, that you're doing on an ongoing basis. What was it about it where you decided, well, I'm going to find out more about this guy?
Well, at first, I thought I was just mildly intrigued. I didn't really, like you said, I was doing other stuff at the time. I was finishing my last book on Jews in Vichy France. I was beginning a new project on Jews in Tunisia. during the Second World War. So I wasn't too, at first, I wasn't going to invest too much time in this project. I looked online, I looked in some books, and there was nothing whatsoever about this man, Robert Griesinger. So he wasn't one of these big Nazis at the top. But nevertheless, I sent some emails to archivists in Prague to see whether they had anything on him, and they responded to say that they did, and would I like to see the documents, because there might be things I find interesting. So off I went to Prague, basically. I can see somebody's typed in the chat. Sorry, I forgot to say this was in 2011, 2012, this was happening. Thanks for the clarification. And do feel free to type stuff in the chat. We can keep this very informal. It's a Q&A. Anyway, so there I was running around Prague, and I was I was obsessed with the armchair. I wanted to know everything about this armchair. I wanted to know who had made it, how much it had cost, the kind of person, the intended buyer. Had this ever belonged to a Jewish family? Because we know that so many objects, especially in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, were seized by the Nazis and were shipped east to furnish some of the new offices that were suddenly emerging in Central and Eastern Europe. So these were all kinds of questions I had. Was it made locally? Was it made in Germany, etc.? So I'm sort of running around Prague with these enormous color photos of the chair which we just saw, interviewing chair makers. And it was very funny because immediately the reaction of chair makers in Prague was completely different to the reaction that had occurred in Amsterdam, where the man was very shocked by the discovery. Whereas in Prague, immediately, I remember going into one shop and the guy was sort of took a puff on his cigarette and said, "Sir, this was communist Czechoslovakia, for God's sake. I find stuff hidden in chairs every single day." For him, it just wasn't a big deal in the slightest that people would want to hide things inside of objects. But while I was doing this work, trying to date the chair and find out as much as I could about the chair, I was going to the archives as well. And that was when I discovered through various papers, various collections, that Robert Griesinger had arrived in Prague in 1943 and that he was a member of the SS. And that wasn't clear from the documents discovered in the chair. I just thought, okay, he's a Nazi bureaucrat in Prague. But immediately, one of my first discoveries showed that he was in the SS.
Is that kind of when the light bulb went on that you really wanted to dig into this
exactly.
a little
and
bit
that
more?
Answers this other question that Andrew has written in the chat. That's exactly right. That's when I thought, oh gosh, this isn't just any old bureaucrat. This is somebody who is, in the SS, for goodness sake. Let's see what else I can find out about this guy.
Well, that's interesting, because he clearly was trying to hide the documentation that he was a Nazi officer.
Not necessarily, because that's assuming.
Why do you think he put these things in the chair? And did you know whether he was alive or dead at that point?
At that point, no, I had absolutely no idea. I presume, well, I knew that he would be dead by 2011, of course, because he was born in 1906. So I presumed, that he was definitely dead, but there was no record. Like I said, there was no record about it in Prague, nothing whatsoever online. I just presumed and I checked to see if he had had a trial. That was very easy to do, or whether he had been executed after the war in a trial in Prague. Nothing. So I just presumed, like most Nazis, he went back to his hometown of Stuttgart after the war and probably resumed life, and then probably died at some point in the 1970s or 1980s. But of course, I had to discover exactly what became of him, and that took some time to do.
So why do you think he put the documents in the chair? Was it because he thought he was going to need them later? And I'm curious as to why a document saying that he was a member of the SS was not in there. In other words, was that something he really wanted to hide, or was it just maybe he didn't have the paperwork with him?
It could be any of these things. Look, there was no note discovered with the document. So there was no sort of final, this is the reason. And, I spent many years wondering this exact question. And, I talk about it a lot in the book, the situation of Prague in spring 1945. What would it have been like to be a German living in Prague. We're talking after 6 years of brutal occupation by the Nazis on the local Czech population. And then you have this sudden moment in May 1945, where Prague just erupts. It's the liberation of the city. You have the Czech partisans, you have the Red Army, you have the local population. And, you know, if you are a German, it is an extremely dangerous place to be. So many had fled by that point. And those who didn't, you know, it was, you know, when you look at the archives, it was pretty awful what was happening. I mean, not compared, you know, I'm not comparing what was going on to the Jewish population in Czechoslovakia from 1938 onwards, because that was obviously, you know, a million times more horrific. But, you know, it was nevertheless a dire place to be. Germans were being rounded up. Many were being shot in public. Many were being thrown into prison camps with terrible sanitation, nothing to eat. Many were just sort of dying in these camps. So as I said, I talk about this a lot in the book, about what it was like to be a German in Prague at that moment. But I think all of this rests on the assumption that he was the one who hid the documents.
Right. Yeah,
that's
somebody else. Not necessarily true.
Right. Goldie has just written in the chat, I see. This is, again, something I reflect on in the book, that, you know, you would have to have been a wonderful with a needle in thread to be able to hide the documents in an armchair, in a cushion that would last 70 years. You know, I'm not sure that, you know, we haven't had a chance yet to talk about who Griesinger was and his background, but my goodness, you know, somebody from his class, you know, this man who was from this very right-wing upper class family from the southwest of Germany, I'm not sure he would have known what to do with a needle and thread.
So yeah, to get into family here. So when the light bulb goes off, this guy was a member of the SS. He was in Prague at this very critical period. What were the steps that you took then to dig out his story?
Right, so it was a lot of hoovering. It was a lot of me going around with my vacuum hoover, just, you know, like I had to do with other projects, because, you know, finding traces of somebody who was seemingly totally unimportant, you know, you can't walk into an archive and just ask for a file on this guy. It's extremely unusual. So a lot of it was trying to find snippets here and there in various collections all over Germany and what is today the Czech Republic. But knowing that he was in the SS, as we heard earlier, was a really important moment, because there is an SS archive in Berlin, and we know that a lot of the documents did survive. Not all, most were destroyed. So for example, towards the end of the war, Allied bombs destroyed so many buildings containing so many papers, of course, and the Nazis, of course, set fire themselves to their own documents. So when it comes to the SS archives, only about a third of the documents managed to survive, including Robert Griezinger's. So I was really fortunate to be able to go to Berlin, get his file, and this was a total treasure trove, because to be in the SS, you know, you really had to prove your Aryan racial stock, your ancestry. So in his diary, in this archive, I was able to see, you know, who his parents were, his grandparents, etc., who he was married to, the names of his daughters, who were born in 1937 and 1939. So it was really, that was like the first sort of real sort of moment where I thought, right, I've got names, I've got ammunition, I can start to really put many more of the pieces together now.
So you mentioned that he was from a conservative, established family with a military background, I believe. And in fact, well, I don't get the impression that Griesinger was a warrior per se, but didn't he have a dueling scar or some mark from earlier in his education?
Yeah. So, sorry, did I interrupt? Did I finish your?
No. I was just curious about his background.
Okay.
And, you know, and kind of what he was steeped in, and how you found out about that too.
No, I mean, these are questions which, you know, they were running through my head for a very, very long time, wanting to know more about the man, because of course I'm finding myself in archives in Prague, in Berlin, in Stuttgart, etc., and really, really wondering about him and his personality and all kinds of things about this ordinary man that we know nothing about as historians. There's so many books on the people at the top, Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, etc. But when it comes to these what I would call ordinary Nazis, these enablers, the people who were allowing the machine to function, there is very, very little. And this is reflected in the archive, that I got so much about his professional life. I knew everything there was to know about what he was doing on a Tuesday or a Wednesday at work as a lawyer in the 1930s when he was at the Gestapo. But in terms of family life, it proved really hard. So I remember one day sitting in Stuttgart and just being so frustrated by these silences in the archives that I just picked up the local telephone directory to Stuttgart and just phoned every single name in the phone book called Griesinger, because I just wanted to track down relatives. I wanted to know what this man was like. And, of course, people were, they must have thought I was completely crazy or trying to sell them something. So a lot of people just hung up immediately. But eventually somebody said, "Oh, Robert Griesinger, yes, that was my father's brother. He was my uncle. How can I help you?" So I was sort of sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, what do I say? I found your uncle's papers in a chair in Prague. He would have thought I was completely crazy. But anyway, I managed to cobble some sort of sentence together, and he invited me over for tea the next day. And that was that was the moment, I suppose, when I really started to get a handle on his family life. That was really, really an entry into the personal realm of this man. Just even going to his house, as soon as I scribbled down the address for tea the next day, I recognized it was the exact same address that Robert Griesinger had lived at. It was the family estate.
It was the family home.
Exactly. And
So,
as soon as I walked into this house, nothing you could tell had ever been sort of thrown out. These, they're like me. These people are hoarders. The Griezingers, just amazing. You could just see the photos, the paintings, the documents, everything.
So you're immediately walking into his context, his family context, and maybe tell us a little bit about the family as you found them at the time.
So I met the nephew and his wife, Jochen and Irmela, and I write about this in the book because they were tremendously helpful with me. They were able to fill in a lot of the pieces. They were able to tell me exactly what happened, according to them, to Robert Griesinger.
And they were willing to speak to you. This wasn't...
yes. Oh, sorry, I should have said that. Yes. I think a lot of people would probably have not wanted to talk to me, but I think, having this remarkable story, being able to sort of show them this picture of an armchair and look what I've got inside of it, I think, that really was able to open a lot of doors for me when I was doing this research with his family. They proved much more willing to talk. I think it's been very difficult for a lot of historians to interview relatives of Nazis. And I feel having this amazing sort of little point of entry proved sort of, it sort of elicited enough interest on that side to make people want to talk to me as a stranger. I'm a complete stranger to these people. But anyway, so one of the first things I noticed in the house as I was arriving were these enormous pillars, these columns emerging from the house right at the entrance. And it just didn't look like any of the houses in Stuttgart. And I was just totally flabbergasted by this. And it just so happened that the plans of the house were there at the entrance. They'd actually kept, it was something to show guests, I think. Anyway, what I was really struck by was the way these columns reminded me of one of these plantations you see often in the American South. And it was at that moment that they explained to me that it was designed directly from a plantation in the American South, because even though Robert Griesinger was born in Germany in 1906, his father was born in New Orleans in 1870, and came from a very long line of well, the first relative sort of arrived in New Orleans in the 1720s.
And here we have a picture of the family home there, right?
No, this is a family home that was built after Robert Griezinger's father had left. But it's still extremely interesting, not just because you can see some of my shirt sleeve in the picture, which I should probably edit, but also because what it does, it shows us that the families were still in touch. So even though Robert Griezinger's family had left New Orleans in the sort of 1880s, after the Civil War, Reconstruction, when they saw, you know, Bismarck's Germany, Imperial Germany, you know, that was the place to be. What's going on in Louisiana? It's Europe. That's where the future lies. Anyway, the families nevertheless were still in touch. They still corresponded with one another. Robert Griezinger knew all about his American cousins that stayed behind in Louisiana. And just by going to Louisiana myself and going through the archives there and tracing the family back, what's extraordinary is the way that his, without doubt, every sort of ancestor had owned an enslaved person at one time or another. You know, he came, one of the relatives I found sort of, I think, had 150 enslaved people on his plantation. And Robert lived in Stuttgart with his American grandmother, who never really learnt German particularly well, Lena. So she left Louisiana. She was born and bred in Louisiana. She left there when she was in her 30s to settle in Imperial Germany. So she, you know, Robert was close to her. And the reason I know all of this, to get back to your original question, Knute, is because I was very lucky that Robert Griezinger's mother kept a diary. And this, for a historian, was total, you know, it was gold dust that his nephew allowed me access to all the family papers. So here's a page, for example. She wrote every single day in her diary. She wrote about her son as a boy growing up during the First World War and the problems that ensued. And, you know, it was remarkable to get an insight into his life. What did it mean to, you know, to have this personal, intimate history of somebody who would go on to be in the SS. And she would include photos and newspaper clippings and all sorts of information about her son.
It's just kind of extraordinary to find that direct link between this future SS officer and the slave-owning family in America. So can you tell us, what was your sense about what the family knew about his career as a Nazi? When did he become a Nazi? Was he a true believer from the very beginning? And did they know about his SS background?
Great question.
Take us through.
So as soon as I arrived in the house, you know, one of the first things that Griezinger's nephew said to me was, you know, why are you interested in this old Nazi? You know, he wasn't that important. He was just a lawyer. So immediately, you know, I hadn't even taken off my coat. It was obvious to me that his family, his nephew, did know something about Robert Griezinger's past. And a lot of this, in terms of him joining and becoming interested in the Nazi Party, look, he came from Stuttgart. He came from a part of Germany which was never particularly attracted to Nazism in a way that other parts of the country were. You know, when you look at election results from sort of the early 1930s, the Southwest, Württemberg, it's always many, many, many percentage points behind when you look at the rest of the country. Nazism just did not take off there in the same way that it did elsewhere. So Griesinger was not a Nazi in 1933. But look, that is not to say that he was some kind of, you know, liberal person. On the contrary, just because there wasn't a Nazi party didn't mean that he didn't have extremist views. When we look even at his mother's diary, what we have is a sense of a young man who grew up in an extremely conservative, right-wing, anti-democratic, monarchist background. And this is very much reflected by his university education. He went to Tübingen, university do not come really more far right than Tübingen. They didn't let Jews into Tübingen. He joined, as we see in this picture, one of these extreme right dueling fraternities where it was very much encouraged to get a scar on your face. And this is something that Griesinger had. If we look at, perhaps later, we'll see one of the pictures. It's very prominent that, you know, he, on his first day, probably when he had his match, the blade would probably like get, you know, rip into his flesh, and as soon as the blood emerged, he would reach for the salt and sort of rub salt into his wound in order to bring out this scar. Perfectly normal for the time. But my point is that this totally anti-Semitic, anti-communist, anti-socialist, anti-Weimar environment he would have got from home, but much more so at university. And so when the Nazis took power in 1933, even though he wasn't a member, for him, it really wasn't such a big step for him to become involved in. He was already, he already had subscribed to so many parts of the ideology. It was sort of, it wasn't a massive conversion for somebody like him.
Right, right. Well, and then, so how does he progress through that? I'm just, you know, how does he end up in the Gestapo or in the SS and eventually Prague?
He joins the SS very, very early, actually, after 1933, because the Nazis ban party membership. They say, no, 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 we're not having any latecomers now, that's it. You know, we want to see who the real Nazis are. So Griesinger is very worried in 1933 because he's not a member of the party. He's got his PhD in law. He wants to become a lawyer in the South. He wants to be in the civil service as a lawyer, and he's not in the party, and he is genuinely worried about this. So but remarkably, thanks to his background and his education, he's able to join the SS. He doesn't even need to join the party. You know, he's able to join the elite of the elite organizations. And he does this in September 1933 very, very easily. But and this is something I kept finding so interesting as I was doing my research, and I write about this, of course, in the book. And that is that the SS just didn't really turn out to be the organization I had thought it was when I began.
What do you mean by that?
So I had, you know, in my previous work, the SS branches that I had come across were people who worked full-time for the SS. That was their full-time occupation, if you like. They wore an SS uniform every single day. Sometimes they worked in concentration camps. Sometimes they were in elite killing squadrons, Waffen-SS. Whereas for Griesinger, who was in the general SS, and tens of thousands of people like Griesinger, the SS was more of a I don't want to say club, but it was something that he could sort of just pay his membership fee, attend meetings maybe once a month, twice a month in uniform. And then, you know, if a big famous Nazi would visit Stuttgart, he might be called up to do some kind of bodyguard duty. But other than that, he had a full-time job as a lawyer. He didn't wear his SS uniform to work. It was only sort of on for meetings where, you know, he was encouraged to bring his wife, bring his daughter. There was this idea of the SS family, which was being nourished at this time. So this isn't a picture of him in SS uniform. This is in army uniform from 1939, but we see very clearly the scar that runs across his face.
So, so he was in the army, he was in the Gestapo, he was in the SS, and one of many. And then how was he assigned to Prague, and what was his job there?
So in Prague, he was working at the Ministry of Economics and Labor. So what that actually meant was he was responsible basically to convert the Czech economy to work for the German war effort, to make sure that factories, for example, were being closed down or workers were being sent to Germany, and that only the most important factory and buildings, etc., were being allowed to function. I mean, it sounds like the most boring job in the world, but my goodness, he coveted this from extremely early on, even from 1939. So after he left the Gestapo, so at the Gestapo, he was, as I said, he's working as a lawyer. So he's not sort of driving around Stuttgart, beating up Jews or communists or anything like that. He's in his suit every day for work. But of course, he knows all too well what's going on in the torture cells beneath him, because a lot of what he's doing is he's making sure that orders which are coming from Berlin are being enforced locally. And everybody in Stuttgart, for goodness sake, knew what was happening in the Gestapo building. Even when I went there to do research, I would speak to very elderly people who, even today, people in their 80s and 90s refuse to walk past the building because they remember the stories that they had heard as children about the torture chambers in the basement of the building. Anyway, I'm digressing slightly. Anyway, he after Prague, after the Gestapo, he is very disappointed that he is in the Wehrmacht, that he's in the German army. He really, really wants an office job. He doesn't want to be getting his hands dirty, with horses and tanks or whatever. He just wants to be sitting in a suit behind an office. And his letters from this time show this tremendously. He is writing to everybody he knows, all his university contacts, his Gestapo contacts, trying to get a transfer. But he doesn't succeed. He has to, first of all, fight in France in 1940. And then he's part of this enormous secret invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. And what was amazing for me, actually, when I'm following his route across Ukraine at that time, was to see that he actually, I was watching his route, and I became very interested in seeing how his particular army unit related to the local Jewish population in Ukraine, because my family, even though all four of my grandparents were born in Britain, none of their parents were. All of my great-grandparents came from Eastern Europe. And I knew that some of them came from Ukraine, from a particular village in Ukraine, a particular shtetl. And so I'm charting his route across Europe, across Ukraine, and just sort of reading in the archives about what's the German army, not like the SS or anything like that, the actual German army, the crimes they're committing against the local Jewish population. And I was just suddenly saw that out of the whole of Ukraine, the largest country in Europe, Griesinger in July 1941 actually stopped for a week in the village that my ancestors had come from. And I suppose at that moment I became much more interested. I've never done family history before. It's just, I always find other people's families so much more interesting than my own. But I suppose at that moment I stopped, I asked for the first time, well, as historians, we often look upwards at families. We look vertically, parents, grandparents, etc. But what happens if we look horizontally? What happens if we start asking questions about, oh, well, this uncle or that cousin who stayed behind in Ukraine and didn't come to London, whatever happened to them? And so that, again, I talk about in the book as well, about the fact that Griezinger arrived in Ukraine at this moment in summer 1941, when members of my family were still living there. Anyway, I know we're nearly out of time, so I know I've got to get to answering your actual question. He gets wounded in Kiev at the Battle of Kiev in September 1941. And after he recovers in hospital, he then gets sent to Prague. And it is the most perfect posting. It's far better than Paris in the sense that it is very far away. So Allied airplanes can't bomb the city. There weren't any bombs dropping on Prague, unlike Germany. And, it had the finest German theater, German cinema. He could send his daughters to the best German schools. It really was a dream posting. So this 2 years, oh, here we have a picture of the family.
The family photo.
Yeah, in Prague. So it really was an absolutely fantastic place to be. And even in summer 1944, one of the documents I discovered inside the Armchair, which startled me somewhat, showed that the family went on a nice summer holiday in July 1944. So after D-Day, after the liberation of Rome, you'd think that, gosh, people would be thinking about, more important things, but they leave, they go to Liechtenstein for 2 weeks, where his wife's parents lived. Liechtenstein was neutral. They didn't need to return, but anyway, they did. The whole family went back to Prague. Oh, so here's a picture of his parents. So this is probably from just before the Second World War, probably 1939. He's holding his oldest daughter, Jutta, and that's Robert Griezinger's parents. So Wally on the left, who kept the diary, and on the right, his father, Adolf, who was born in New Orleans.
Daniel, you use a term in the book of desk murderer. And I wonder how you would categorize Robert Griesinger. Was he, I mean, we know he was part of this machine, but how would you begin to sort of look at him morally and in terms of what he was actually doing in Prague?
Yeah, no, it's something which I've thought about a lot, and I have absolutely no doubt that Robert Griezinger was a perpetrator in the Holocaust. You know, even though he personally didn't kill anybody, well, he might have when he was a soldier, but even though he himself was not rounding up Jews with his hands, shooting them in concentration camps or anything like that, the work he did at the Gestapo in the mid-1930s, where he was responsible for sending out memos, for making sure that anti-Semitic legislation was being enforced, that people were being brought in for questioning, the fact that he served alongside killing squadrons on the Eastern Front as local Jewish population was being murdered in spring and summer 1941, the fact that in Prague he was responsible for sending so many thousands of Czech workers to work in Germany in horrific conditions. You know, a lot of these Czech workers, so many of them died. There were so many suicides. It was utterly horrific. You know, he was entirely responsible and was very much played a significant role, I would argue, and knew exactly what he was doing. He was able to, you know, change and switch effortlessly from being this wonderful father and son and husband and loving and caring man, just to being this cold-hearted, cunning individual, which is something we see in the archives on many occasions.
This picture of the Rothschilds, can you just give us an idea of how they fit into the story?
So when I was looking into his life, I was very curious to know a little bit more about, you know, whether he had known any Jewish people. And this was often something I wondered about. And so when I got one of his addresses, so when he got married in February 1936, just after during the Winter Olympics, which were being held in Germany that year, he and his new wife, Gisela, they moved to this lovely street in Stuttgart. And when I'm looking at the list of residents, I came across his next door neighbor, the actual next door neighbor, this family called the Rothschilds. And so I just was very interested in this family that had, you know, such an obviously Jewish name. And I wanted to visit the house to understand a little bit, you know, what does it mean to be a next door neighbor? You could be a next door neighbor and they live, you know, 500 yards away, or they could be closer. So I went to the house and the new owners very kindly showed me around. And, you know, just from being inside, you know, upon arrival, it was very clear that the families knew each other. They interacted because it was just a wall separating the two families. The house was detached. And eventually I managed to track down the granddaughter of Fritz and Helena Rothschild, who told me about what became of the version of events she had heard. And then I went to check in the archives to find out more precisely what happened to her grandparents. And what was interesting was the level of the degree to which they wore their Jewish identity on their sleeve, and the degree to which they actually kept a lot of the Jewish traditions, such as she was utterly convinced that they had a mezuzah on their door, on their doorpost, which of course Robert Griesinger would have seen because their doorposts were so close. And let's not forget, he's working at the Gestapo at this point, and he's an SS member. And also she was able to tell me more about, you know, that they would have lit candles on Shabbat, etc. So, and as I suggested earlier, I then wanted to know much more about this couple and what became of them. So I was able to follow more their history. First in Stuttgart, and then later they actually moved to Nazi-occupied Paris, which I do know a lot about. So I was able to follow them much more closely there until they were eventually deported to Auschwitz in May 1944.
Well, before we run out of time, I wonder if you could tell us what you know about what happened to Griesinger.
So, and again, this is based on a lot of research, based in archives, but also speaking to family members. At the end of the war, in 1945, Griesinger sent his wife and daughters away. It was possible to be evacuated at that point. Wives and children could leave the protectorate. They could get out of Prague. So he did that at the beginning, during spring 1945. And then he was still going to work every single day. And even after Hitler committed suicide, Griesinger is still going to work every day. There's no doubt about it. And then eventually, at the time of the uprising in Prague, Griesinger disappears from the records. And what we have is a version of events from his family, according to which in 1946, after the war, his mother tried to discover what happened to her son because he did not return from Prague. His wife and daughters were waiting for him and he just never came. And his mother sent somebody, a Czech woman, a Czech neighbor who she knew well in Stuttgart, to investigate. She spent time in Prague, and she came back with some earth from a cemetery and said to Griezinger's mother, your son, I've done my research, your son was murdered at the end of the war. His body was thrown on a mass grave. Here is some earth from that mass grave. He was killed in a hospital. Now, and then for the rest of her life, you know, she just devoted the rest of her life to the memory of her son. So you look at, she sort of had this enormous bronze bust of her son's head. I don't have a picture of it here, but it's in the book, which sort of was surrounded by candles and a big shroud. It was something, her son's death affected her for the rest of her life. But going to Prague, looking through the archives, presents a different version of events. What I get a sense of there is that that version could be true because we know that so many Germans were being killed either by the Red Army or by Czech partisans throughout spring and summer 1945. But when you go and look at the actual documents, the actual evidence, it never says, you know, shooting, mass grave. You know, it says things like whooping cough, dysentery, these kind of illnesses appear on death certificates. So look, the truth is somewhere in between. We are never going to know, but his actual death certificate says that he died in a hospital in Prague in September 1945 of dysentery. Again, so many people, Germans, I heard story after story of Germans in hospitals from that time being taken from their hospital beds by the Red Army or by Czech partisans. They would be marched up to the roof of the hospital, just as you had sort of soldiers down at the bottoms with their rifles pointing upwards. And it would be a competition. You'd throw the German off the roof from the top floor and see whether or not he would die either by his body smashing onto the ground or being shot by one of the bullets from the men at the bottom. So we know that this happened multiple occasions throughout spring and summer 1945.
Well, Daniel, we're going to have to leave the conversation part there and go to questions and answers. Thank you so much. I know we've got a lot of questions that have come in. people are going to want to know about the family and memory and other aspects. So, but yeah, Ilana.
Sure.
Thank you.
Well,
Knute.
thank you both so much. Well, Daniel, one of the questions that's come up from a number of people is, have you been in touch with the daughters or the grandchildren? And what, if so, what has been their reaction to this research in your book?
So thanks, Alana. Yes, absolutely. I was able to track down the daughters because at first it was very hard because I had their names from the archives. I knew what their names were as little girls, but often when you're tracing women in history, it becomes rather difficult because women get married and then often take on their husband's name. So it proved very, very hard to find his daughters. But when I located the nephew in Stuttgart, he was able to tell me that his cousins, so Griezinger's daughters, had got married, and here are their names, but they're no longer in touch. They had a sort of a falling out about 50 years ago, and they haven't spoken since. So he gave me the names, and then I was left to make contact with the two daughters. And the two daughters, one lives in Switzerland and one lives in Germany. And you know, it took a long time to sort of, for them to feel comfortable with me answering my questions. But I think, you know, if you just look at my acknowledgements to the book, you know, I couldn't have done this without them. They were so open, they were so encouraging, and they really, really wanted to know as much as they could about their father, because as I said, he died in 1945 and his daughters were very young, they were children. And after the war, they spent so much time trying to ask their mother and other relatives about their father. They wanted to know everything, but there were just so many silences, which was not uncommon. There was many German children were ignored when they asked their parents about what they had done during the Third Reich. So, and Griezinger's wife had then remarried. She had a new family. There were of course no photos of their father anymore. So anywhere. So I think at one point they really just gave up asking, which meant that when I came along, you know, 70 years after the end of the war, they really did know very, very little about their father. So it was a very curious relationship at first between me and the daughters that I, as a historian, you know, usually when I do my interviews, I would ask my questions, I'd have my answers, I might have a cup of tea, and then I would go home. Whereas here, I would ask my questions and get my answers, but then they would sort of pause and be like, okay, now we have questions for you. And they would ask me a ton of questions because they knew that I'd been to all these archives all over the place in New Orleans and Stuttgart and blah, blah, blah. And they just wanted to know everything about their father. And it was really interesting to see their reactions, which really did change over time and depending on the context.
So Daniel, just as a last question here to kind of close us out, what do you think this book has to teach us about this history? What can we take away from this story?
Well, I think it's a good question. I think that, look, it's very easy today for us when we're thinking about sort of the rise of extremism or nationalism or whatever you want to call it. It's very easy for us to fixate on those people who are at the very top, the people making the loudest noise, who are giving these big speeches and whose words are being captured in headlines. All over the world. You know, well, who are the people supporting these extremist personalities? Who is upholding this? Who is enabling these messages to get across? Like, why are these messages being embraced? And I think that's what I'm trying to do in my book. So turning the spotlight away from the people at the very, very top and just look a bit more at the tens and thousands, even millions of people whose histories have not been told and quite frankly, probably never will be. So, you know, just really trying to make Griezinger just stand in for so many thousands and thousands of other enablers who allowed the machine to do what it did.
I think that's a powerful message. I mean, I think that is a call to each one of us to look at what is our role and what are we doing? How are we either, as you say, enabling what's going on, preventing it, acting against it, that we're all taking a part in it in one way or another, not just the loudest or the most extreme. Yeah, that's a powerful, powerful message. I want to thank you both so much for being a part of this program and for helping us to wrap up our 2020 year. Here's the book. I know a couple of you were looking at it again, the SS Officer's Armchair. You can purchase it at any local bookseller, online, pick your local bookstore of choice and you can order it. Thank you again, Daniel Lee and Knute Berger, for being a part of this program. And thank you to all of you for joining us today on this Tuesday. This program was recorded, so if you want to go back and watch it or share it with others, you'll find it on our website starting tomorrow, along with all of our other past Lunch and Learn programs. Thank you to our incredible staff at the Holocaust Center. These programs are truly a team effort. I want to give a very special thank you to Richard Green, who's running the technology behind the scenes here. He's our museum and technology director. Also, thank you to our executive director, Dee Simon, and our entire team, Nicole Bella, Lori Werschel-Cohen, Julia Thompson, Paul Regelbrug, Rosa Campos, Sydney Drato, Ellie Selesky, Amanda Davis, and Katie Lawrence. Thank you again for joining us for our last program of 2020. We look forward to seeing you back here on Tuesday, January 5th with local author David Laskin, who will talk about his book, The Family, and there's lots more to come in 2021. Thank you, and this concludes our program for today.